Usually when you sit down to read a novel, there is this deeply ingrained, almost cultural expectation of tranquility. Like you set the scene right.
Right. You curate the whole moment.
Yeah, exactly. You've got your cup of tea or maybe a coffee. You adjust the ambient lighting so it's just right. You sit in a comfortable chair and you open to page 1 of an actual physical book.
Yeah, and the unspoken promise of that moment is that you're about to slip seamlessly into another world. The rest of the universe is just supposed to, fade away, leaving you entirely immersed in the narrative.
It's framed as this ultimate escape, a deliberate pause.
Absolutely. A sanctuary of quiet immersion away from all the demands of the day.
That is the expectation anyway. But if you actually try to execute that seemingly simple action today, you quickly realize that the peaceful reading chair has basically become a battleground.
Oh, totally.
You get through maybe 10 pages, and that's if you're lucky. You're tracking the plot, you're taking in the words, and then suddenly, there it is. It just creeps up the back of your neck.
That itch.
Yes, this overwhelming, visceral, almost physical compulsion to put the book down, reach into your pocket, and check your phone. And the crazy thing is, you aren't expecting an urgent text.
Right. It's not like you're waiting for emergency news.
No, not at all. You don't have a specific piece of information you need to look up. It's literally just an itch in your brain that demands to be scratched.
And the contrast between the activity and your internal response is staggering when you think about it. You've intentionally carved out this time for relaxation, yet you are suddenly plunged into a state of acute internal crisis.
Right.
You're physically holding a static object, ink on paper, and your own mind is actively rebelling against the stillness of it.
It is genuinely alarming when you take a step back and observe yourself in that moment. I mean, your brain is practically screaming at you to abandon the nuanced, imaginative world of this novel in favor of a small, glowing rectangle.
A rectangle that's probably just going to show you a video of someone you don't even know eating a sandwich.
Exactly. Okay, so let's unpack this, because our deep dive today is going to dissect the mechanical reality of why that exact scenario happens to almost all of us. And we're looking at this through a highly unusual but incredibly revealing lens.
Yeah, this source material is fascinating.
It really is. Our sources today come from an unscripted style educational transcript. But it's not a psychology textbook or like a tech manifesto. It's actually a dialogue from an advanced language masterclass taught by 2 instructors aimed at achieving C2 level English proficiency.
And to contextualize that, for anyone unfamiliar with the European framework of reference for languages, C2 is not just about getting your verb tenses correct.
Right, it's not ordering food in a restaurant.
Exactly. It is the absolute highest echelon of language mastery. It represents the ability to engage effortlessly in highly complex, abstract intellectual discourse. A C2 speaker doesn't just communicate. They command the linguistic architecture to convey profound nuance, subtle emotional shifts, and absolute authority.
It's like the language becomes a scalpel used to dissect complicated ideas.
That's a great way to put it, yeah.
Which is exactly what makes this specific source material so gripping. The instructors don't teach this elite level of grammar and vocabulary in a sterile vacuum. They aren't just, handing out flashcards.
No, they are using these advanced linguistic tools to dissect 2 of the most pressing sociological and psychological crises of our modern era.
So our mission with this deep dive is a dual journey.
Right. The transcript forces us to operate on 2 parallel tracks. First, we are tasked with examining the substantive content, like what is happening to our cognitive faculties on a biological level, and simultaneously what is happening to our physical communities on a sociological level.
And the instructors frame this as the rise of the attention economy and the devastating evaporation of our third places.
Exactly. We have to understand the mechanics of those crises. But second, and crucially, we're analyzing the precise, high-level vocabulary and the sophisticated grammatical structures required to articulate these phenomena with real authority.
And for you listening right now, if you've ever felt utterly exhausted just trying to focus on a single task for 30 minutes, or if you've ever felt strangely, deeply isolated despite carrying a device that gives you instant access to thousands of digital contacts, this deep dive is going to lay out the exact architecture of your experience.
It really explains the trap.
It does. We're going to explore the biological and sociological traps you've been placed in. But more than that, we are equipping you with the exact C2 level terminology and grammar to discuss it. We are handing you the linguistic tools to understand and articulate your own reality.
Because there is immense power in that combination. When you merely experience a problem, you are essentially a passive victim of your circumstances. You feel the anxiety of wanting to check your phone, but you lack the framework to understand it.
You just feel bad about yourself?
Right. But once you comprehend the underlying mechanics of that anxiety and you possess the precise language to describe it to others, you transition into an active participant. You can begin to dismantle the trap because you finally have the words to describe its gears and springs.
So let's start dismantling those gears right now by looking at the first segment of the transcript, which tackles the attention economy and this terrifying loss of our cognitive endurance.
Yeah, the dialogue in our source material features two colleagues discussing that exact scenario we just outlined, trying to read a physical book and feeling an irresistible compulsion to abandon it after a few minutes.
And one of the speakers perfectly diagnoses the feeling. They use the phrase, "It's like my cognitive endurance is completely evaporated."
Let's isolate that phrase, cognitive endurance, because the vocabulary choice there is doing some heavy lifting.
Oh,
By combining cognitive, which relates to conscious intellectual activity, with endurance, the speaker fundamentally reframes how we think about attention.
because attention is no longer treated as a passive state of being.
Right.
Like whether you are awake or asleep.
Exactly. It's framed as a muscle. Endurance implies stamina, the capacity to withstand a prolonged, strenuous effort against resistance.
And the resistance in this case is the urge to do something easier. But the really striking word in that sentence is evaporated.
Oh, it's such a specific choice.
The speaker doesn't say their cognitive endurance is fatigued. They don't say it's tired from a long day at the office. They say it has evaporated.
It has changed states from a liquid to a gas.
Right, and simply vanished into the atmosphere. It suggests a total structural collapse of their ability to hold focus.
And the word evaporated also conveys a sense of quiet, almost imperceptible loss. Water doesn't evaporate with a loud crash.
Yeah, there's no explosion.
Right. It slowly disappears until the glass is just inexplicably empty. The speaker is expressing shock that a capacity they once possessed, like the ability to sit and read a book for 2 hours, has silently vanished without them even noticing.
As I was reading through this section of the masterclass, I kept thinking about how we conceptualize this loss. We often think of our daily focus like a savings account.
Okay, yeah.
Like you wake up with a finite balance of attention to spend on your family, your work, your hobbies. But that analogy feels incomplete when you factor in the mechanisms of the digital world described in the text.
How so?
Well, the tech companies aren't just dipping their hands into your savings account and stealing a few coins. They have redesigned the entire currency system.
Ah, I see what you mean.
They've created a highly tuned, algorithmic feedback loop that treats your focus not as something to be preserved, but as a raw resource to be mined relentlessly. Think of your focus like a savings account, and tech companies are treating it like an all-you-can-grab cash register.
That feedback loop is the defining characteristic of what the source material calls the attention economy. And the text is very deliberate in pointing out that our attention spans have not simply shortened organically due to, the natural evolution of the human brain.
Right, it's not an accident.
Not at all. The transcript explicitly states that our cognitive endurance has been systematically dismantled.
Systematically dismantled. That is a heavy, loaded phrase. It completely removes the idea of this being a mistake. You don't systematically dismantle an engine by accident.
No, it requires tools, blueprints, and a very specific intent.
And what is the intent?
Well, the intent is entirely financial. The text reminds us that in the digital age, human attention is the ultimate foundational currency. The largest technology companies in the world are deploying billions of dollars and hiring the brightest behavioral psychologists and software engineers for a single unified purpose.
To figure out precisely how to hijack your cognitive pathways.
Exactly. Your sustained attention is the product that they are packaging and selling to advertisers. The longer you look at the screen, the more money changes hands.
So your ability to read a novel in quiet isolation is a direct threat to their business model.
It absolutely is. When you sit in that reading chair and feel the compulsion to pick up your phone, you are not experiencing a personal failure of willpower. You are going up against a multi-billion-dollar systemic design flaw that has been explicitly engineered to break your concentration.
We are bringing a knife to a gunfight. Actually, no, we're bringing a physical paperback book to an algorithmic supercomputer fight.
That's very true.
Which brings us to a really powerful piece of C2 vocabulary that the instructors highlight in their masterclass, the word splintered.
Yes, splintered.
The speaker in the dialogue is describing the aftermath of this systemic dismantling. And they say, now my focus is so splintered that even answering a long email feels like climbing a mountain.
Splintered is an exceptionally evocative word choice, and it perfectly demonstrates why C2 proficiency goes beyond basic vocabulary. Consider the alternatives, right?
Like saying your focus is divided.
Exactly. If the speaker had said their focus was divided, it implies a neat mathematical separation, perhaps splitting your attention between two tasks. Or if they said their focus was distracted, it sounds mild, like a temporary diversion that can be easily corrected.
But splintered.
Right. Picture a solid piece of hardwood that has been struck violently by a hammer.
It doesn't break cleanly into two pieces. It shatters. It turns into hundreds of jagged, sharp, fragmented shards that can never be perfectly glued back together.
The physical imagery of wood splintering implies a violent destruction of something that was originally whole and strong. When applied to human cognition, it vividly illustrates what has happened to our capacity for deep work. Our attention hasn't just been diverted, it has been shattered into microscopic increments of time.
Deep work, which the text defines as those complex, long-form tasks that require sustained, unbroken concentration. It's the kind of intense cognitive effort required to write a proposal, learn a new language, or even have a deeply nuanced conversation.
The work that actually moves the needle in your personal and professional life.
Yes. But the dialogue points out a cascading effect here. Because our focus is entirely splintered, our brains become exhausted just trying to hold a thought together. And in that state of cognitive exhaustion, the text notes that we inevitably default to the path of least resistance.
And the path of least resistance is a concept borrowed from physics. Water flowing down a mountain will always find the easiest route, bypassing boulders and flowing into crevices. Energy flows where it requires the least amount of effort.
So in terms of human behavior,
when your cognitive endurance has evaporated, your brain actively seeks to avoid strenuous effort. Climbing the metaphorical mountain of writing a thoughtful, nuanced email requires drawing on reserves of focus that you simply do not possess anymore.
So your brain scans its environment for an action that requires zero cognitive endurance. It looks for the absolute lowest possible barrier to entry. And what is easier than moving your thumb half an inch across a smooth glass screen? Endless scrolling is the ultimate path of least resistance. It requires no output, no critical thinking, and no sustained attention. You are just a passive receptacle for fragmented visual stimuli.
And that transition from the difficulty of deep work to the ease of scrolling introduces the biological mechanisms at play. Because the source material doesn't just describe the sociological outcome, it moves deeply into the internal machinery of the brain.
Right, we're getting into the biology now.
The instructors introduce another vital C2 word to describe how these algorithms function, and that word is insidious.
Let's break down the mechanics of insidious, because we throw words like harmful or dangerous around a lot, but insidious has a very specific, almost sinister flavor to it.
It does. A sudden catastrophe, like a roof collapsing, is dangerous, but it is not insidious. The danger is obvious and immediate. Something that is insidious causes tremendous harm, but it does so by developing gradually and stealthily, often without being noticed until the damage is severe. Black mold growing inside a wall is insidious. A slow-acting toxin that you ingest in microscopic amounts every day without tasting it is insidious.
Wow, yeah. So the transcript applies this word directly to the digital algorithms because they do not announce their intent. They slowly, imperceptibly alter our baseline behaviors.
Precisely. And the way they alter those behaviors is by explicitly targeting and exploiting our dopamine loops. The text brings in the concept of neuroplasticity to explain this.
Neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to rewire itself.
Right. It's the foundational mechanism of learning and adaptation. In neurological terms, it refers to the brain's ability to constantly reorganize itself by forming new neural connections throughout a person's life in response to their environment.
So if you practice the piano every day, your brain physically rewires its pathways to make your fingers move more efficiently across the keys.
Exactly. Your brain adapts to whatever stimuli you feed it.
So what happens when the primary stimulus you feed your brain is a relentless, algorithmically curated feed of 30-second videos?
Well, the brain does what it is designed to do. It adapts. But in this context, it is a maladaptive rewiring. The algorithms are designed to provide unpredictable, intermittent rewards. A funny video, a highly engaging news headline, a notification that someone liked your photo, this triggers the release of dopamine.
And it's crucial to understand how that dopamine loop actually functions, because a lot of people think dopamine is just the pleasure chemical, but it's really the anticipation and motivation chemical.
Yes, that's a key distinction.
The spike doesn't just happen when you see the funny video, it happens when you open the app, anticipating what you might find. It's the exact same psychological mechanism as pulling the lever on a slot machine. You don't know what you're going to get, which makes the brain crave the input even more.
The insidious nature of this process is that neuroplasticity works against us here. Our brains physically rewire their baseline expectations. The baseline shifts from expecting a slow, steady stream of information, like reading a book, to expecting a hyper-stimulating, rapid-fire hit of dopamine every few seconds.
This explains the panic we feel in the reading chair. It's not just a bad habit or a lack of discipline. It is a biological withdrawal symptom.
Exactly.
We have actively trained our neural pathways to require a chemical hit. And when we remove the device that delivers that hit, the brain sounds an alarm. The transcript points out that this withdrawal manifests as a persistent, low-grade anxiety when we are separated from our screens.
It's a genuine physiological response.
Now, I want to push back on this a little bit based on the text, because one of the speakers in the dialogue brings up a scenario that I think every single listener will instantly recognize. They describe standing in a queue at the grocery store. They realize they have maybe 30 to 45 seconds of waiting time, and instantly, reflexively, they pull out their phone.
It is an automatic reflex. The hand moves to the pocket before the conscious mind even registers the decision.
Right. But here's my question. Why is that inherently a bad thing? Like, if we know this neuroplastic rewiring is happening, why do we just feel a low-grade anxiety when we don't have our screens? Why can't we just enjoy a spare 30 seconds in a queue? Or rather, isn't boredom just an evolutionary signal that we are wasting time?
Okay, I see where you're going.
If I have 30 seconds, why shouldn't I use it to check the news or read a productivity article or even just entertain myself? Why are we revering this empty void of standing in a grocery line doing absolutely nothing? Isn't the desire to constantly consume information just a drive for efficiency?
That is a highly rationalization-driven argument, and honestly, it is exactly how the tech industry defends its products.
Right, they say they're providing a service.
But what's fascinating here is how the source material dismantles that defense by examining the true cognitive cost of that supposed efficiency. The dialogue argues that the real tragedy of this insidious rewiring is the death of boredom. The text makes a profound foundational claim. Boredom is the birthplace of creativity.
Boredom is the birthplace of creativity. We do treat boredom like a disease that needs to be instantly medicated, don't we? If we feel even a flicker of it, we apply the screen to make it go away.
We self-medicate with data, but the sociological and psychological reality is that boredom is not a failure of productivity. It is a necessary fertile void.
A fertile void, I like that.
To understand why boredom is the birthplace of creativity, we have to look at what the brain does when it is not processing external stimuli. When you are staring blankly at the back of the person's head in the grocery line, your brain switches to what neuroscientists call the default mode network.
It's basically the brain's background processing mode.
Exactly. When you are bored, your mind is untethered from immediate external tasks. It is forced to wander. It starts sifting through your memories, connecting disparate pieces of information, dreaming up future scenarios, and reflecting on your own emotional state.
Which is where ideas come from.
That internal wandering is the literal definition of creative thought. It is how you solve complex problems in your life. You don't solve a deep personal dilemma by staring at a rapidly moving fee veil. You solve it by letting your mind idle.
So by aggressively filling every micro moment of our day, every 30 seconds in a line, every 2 minutes waiting for a train, we are saturating our cognitive bandwidth with useless, disposable information. We think we're being efficient, but the masterclass dialogue argues we're actually actively robbing ourselves.
We are robbing ourselves of the mental space required for self-reflection and profound thought. Your cognitive bandwidth is finite. If the entirety of your mental processing power is consumed by trying to parse a barrage of 30-second videos, political arguments, and lifestyle advertisements, there are simply no resources left to look inward.
You just don't have the juice left.
You cannot have a profound realization about your life or your relationships or your career if your brain is perpetually occupied by digital noise.
We are terrified of the silence because the silence is where we actually have to face ourselves.
Yeah.
And this brings up the inevitable question of a solution, right? When faced with this overwhelming biological and psychological hijack, The instinct is to seek a quick fix.
Of course.
In the masterclass dialogue, one speaker suggests the classic modern remedy, a digital detox. You know the drill you announce you're taking the weekend off social media, you put your phone in a drawer, you go for a hike in the woods, and you assume you have cured the problem.
And the other speaker in the text immediately and aggressively shoots that idea down. They use an incredibly vivid, striking metaphor to explain why a digital detox is a fundamental misunderstanding of the problem. They say a digital detox is just a Band-Aid on a bullet wound.
Oh man, a Band-Aid on a bullet wound. Let's really deconstruct that imagery because it's a common phrase, but it is doing very specific work in this C2 level transcript.
Let's do it.
A Band-Aid is designed to treat a superficial, temporary injury, a scrape, a minor cut that the body will naturally heal on its own in a few days.
A bullet wound, on the other hand, is a catastrophic structural injury. It damages internal organs, it causes severe hemorrhage, and it requires major surgical intervention to stabilize. By comparing the attention economy to a bullet wound, the speaker is emphasizing the sheer scale of the psychological damage.
So a weekend hike without your phone is a Band-Aid. It might feel nice for 48 hours, but it does absolutely nothing to address the neuroplastic rewiring that has physically altered your brain structure.
Nothing at all.
It certainly doesn't dismantle the multi-billion-dollar algorithms that are patiently waiting for you on Monday morning. The bullet is still lodged in your cognitive architecture, and the environment that fired it hasn't changed at all.
The source material insists that we cannot casually interact with these technologies and expect to maintain our focus. A weekend detox is a delusion of control. The text argues that the only real remedy requires a radical restructuring of how we interact with our environment.
We have to change our baseline approach.
Yes. We must stop treating attention as an unlimited, renewable resource and begin treating it as a finite, sacred resource.
A finite, sacred resource. When you label something as finite, you acknowledge that it can be entirely depleted. Once your daily focus is gone, it is gone. You cannot manufacture more out of thin air.
Right.
And when you label something as sacred, you elevate it to a status that requires vigorous, uncompromising protection. You don't hand a sacred artifact over to the first person who knocks on your door. Yet we hand our sacred attention over to the first app that sends a push notification.
Protecting a sacred resource requires establishing impenetrable boundaries. And this introduces a brilliant pivot in the masterclass transcript. To truly fight against this systemic, insidious issue, to build those boundaries, we need the appropriate linguistic tools to articulate the problem with absolute conviction.
If you want to argue for the protection of your mind, you cannot use passive language.
Exactly. This is where the instructors seamlessly transition from the sociology of the attention economy to a masterclass in grammatical structure.
The linguistic architecture of emphasis. They introduce a C2 level grammatical tool known as the cleft sentence. I find it fascinating how the transcript intertwines the crisis with the grammar.
It's very clever.
It suggests that if your brain has been hijacked by algorithms, you must reclaim your agency by commanding your language. You can't just casually mention that your focus is gone. You have to declare it with authority.
Yeah.
So functionally, what is a cleft sentence? How does it operate?
In advanced English syntax, a cleft sentence is a structure specifically engineered to shine a blinding spotlight on one particular element of a sentence. The word cleft originates from the verb to cleave, meaning to divide or split.
Like a meat cleaver.
Exactly. Mechanically, you take a standard simple sentence and you split it into two distinct clauses to create dramatic, undeniable emphasis on a specific piece of information.
Okay, let's look at the mechanics of this because it actually plays into the psychology of how humans process information. The masterclass text provides a great starting example. Let's look at the standard flat version of the sentence first. The loss of boredom disturbs me most.
Grammatically, that sentence is perfectly sound. It communicates the basic facts. However, stylistically, it is entirely flat. It is a passive transmission of data. All the words carry equal weight, so nothing stands out.
It doesn't have any punch. It's the kind of sentence that gets lost in a conversation. But when the speaker in the dialogue applies the cleft structure, they transform that flat sentence into something incredibly powerful. They split it and say, what I find most disturbing is the loss of boredom.
Let's analyze the cognitive effect of that structure on the listener. By beginning with the phrase, what I find most disturbing, you are intentionally delaying the arrival of the crucial information. You're creating a grammatical drum roll.
What I find most disturbing. The listener's brain instantly leans in. Their brain says, wait, what is it? What does this person find disturbing? You are forcing them to anticipate the subject.
You manufacture suspense. You hold the listener's attention hostage for a fraction of a second, and then you deliver the payload, is the loss of boredom. By the time the subject arrives, the listener's mind is perfectly primed to absorb it as a statement of profound importance.
It's almost manipulative in a good way.
It is. The masterclass instructors emphasize that deploying structures like this in an exam or in a boardroom or a serious debate proves that you possess absolute control over the flow of information. It instantly shifts your tone from someone who is merely observing a problem to an authoritative thinker who is diagnosing it.
Let's bat some of these examples from the source material back and forth, because they are incredibly fun to play with once you understand the mechanics. Let's say we are discussing the algorithms we just analyzed. A C1 speaker, or just an average conversationalist, might say, "The insidious nature of the algorithms truly frightens me." It's fine. But if you want to command the room with a cleft sentence, you rearrange the architecture and say,
"What truly frightens me is the insidious nature of the algorithms. The emphasis is inescapable."
Okay, I love it. Or, if I want to discuss the realization that my cognitive endurance has vanished, the flat, unremarkable sentence is, "I realized recently that my focus is splintered." It sounds like a passing thought, but the cleft sentence turns it into a dramatic revelation. It wasn't until recently that I realized my cognitive endurance had evaporated.
That specific structure, it wasn't until that, highlights the duration of ignorance before the sudden moment of clarity. And for a definitive call to action, the transformation is even more striking. Instead of the weak bureaucratic phrasing, "We must address the systemic issue," you cleft it to center the problem. It is the systemic issue that we must address.
Oh, wow, you can physically feel the difference in how that lands. It sounds like you were banging a gavel on a desk. It is the systemic issue that we must address. If you speak that way, people have no choice but to listen to you as an expert.
Attaining that level of command is the entire purpose of C2 Proficiency. It is not just about making yourself understood. It is about wielding the language as a tool to convey nuance, passion, and irrefutable authority. And the instructors use this exact grammatical tool to transition us into the second major crisis analyzed in the text.
How to do that?
Well, one of the instructors highlights a cleft sentence that bridges the two topics perfectly. It is the disappearance of communal spaces that we must examine next.
That transition is brilliant because the two crises are mirror images of each other. The insidious algorithms have infiltrated our internal mental space, hijacking our attention and our capacity for boredom.
Right.
But simultaneously, the physical external landscape of our lives is being systematically dismantled. The internal crisis is mirroring an external collapse. This leads us directly into the text analysis of the erosion of third places and the destruction of what they call the architecture of community.
To fully grasp the severity of this external collapse, we have to look at the sociological framework the source provides. Sociologists have long categorized the physical domains of our lives into three distinct spheres. The first place is the domestic sphere, your home, where you experience private family life.
Okay, first place is home.
The second place is the domain of structured obligation, your workplace or your school, where interactions are governed by hierarchy and productivity.
Those first two domains are rigidly structured. You know your role in your house, and you certainly know your role at your job. But the source argues that a society cannot survive on just domestic privacy and economic labor.
No, it can't.
The critical load-bearing pillar for a healthy functioning society is the third place.
The transcript defines a third place as a neutral, communal gathering space. It is an environment where people congregate entirely outside the rigid expectations of home or work. Historically, these took the form of the local neighborhood pub, a sprawling public park, a community library, or a traditional coffee house.
These are spaces built on the premise of low-stakes social interaction.
Exactly, where the primary activity is simply being in the presence of others.
These are spaces where you are allowed to just exist. You don't have to produce a spreadsheet, and you don't have to do the dishes. You are just a member of a community. But the masterclass dialogue points out that these physical spaces are disappearing or transforming at a terrifying rate.
They really are.
And the consequence of this loss isn't just that we have fewer places to hang out. It has triggered a literal crisis of public health. The text cites the staggering statistic that loneliness and social isolation are now considered a public health crisis, on par with the physical damage caused by smoking.
We need to pause on that comparison because it is chilling. We all recognize the physical devastation inflicted by smoking, the destruction of lung tissue, the cardiovascular disease, the measurable shortening of a lifespan.
Right.
To equate loneliness with that level of physiological harm elevates isolation from a mere feeling of sadness to a biological toxin. Prolonged isolation elevates cortisol levels, weakens the immune system, and accelerates cognitive decline.
Wow.
The source introduces a deeply resonant C2 vocabulary word to describe the societal state that produces this toxicity: atomized.
Atomized. Let's look at the root of that word. An atom is the smallest unit of ordinary matter. When a substance is atomized, like water being pushed through a spray nozzle, it is broken down into millions of tiny, disconnected, free-floating droplets that never touch each other.
That is the precise imagery the speaker is utilizing. An atomized society is one where the fundamental bonds connecting individuals have been severed. We are no longer a cohesive, unified compound.
Or just floating droplets.
We have been broken down into isolated, single-unit consumers floating around in a shared physical space, but never truly interacting. And the dialogue explicitly points to the hyper-commodification of these third places as the primary driver of this atomization.
This is where the text's observation of modern life is just painfully accurate. Let's talk about hyper-commodification.
Let's do it.
The historical coffee house, the original third place, was a chaotic hub of debate, gossip, and community news. It was where you went to find out what was happening in your town. But the speaker points out that even our cafes have been fundamentally altered. They've become purely transactional.
The word transactional identifies a shift in the core purpose of the environment. A space that is transactional is defined exclusively by the exchange of goods for money.
Right.
The value of the space is no longer rooted in gathering or lingering. It is rooted entirely in purchasing. If you are not actively consuming a product, you have no right to occupy the space.
The dialogue paints a vivid, almost cinematic picture of what this looks like in practice today. You walk into a modern minimalist cafe, you order a $6 latte through an app so you don't even have to speak to the barista.
You avoid the human contact right off the bat.
Exactly. You pick up the cup, you immediately put on a pair of large noise-canceling headphones, you sit at a small table, you open a laptop, and you ignore every single human being in the room for 3 hours.
That scenario is the epitome of an atomized existence. You are physically surrounded by your community, yet you are completely sealed off from it. The phrase noise-canceling headphones serves as a potent physical metaphor in this text.
It really does.
It is a piece of technology you literally clamp over your ears to broadcast a universal signal to your neighbors. I am actively blocking out your existence. Do not interact with me.
Have we simply traded community for convenience? We have decided that the friction of having to engage in small talk with a stranger, or the mild annoyance of hearing someone else's conversation, is simply too high a price to pay.
So we pay the $6 for the latte, and we purchase the right to absolute isolation.
And in doing so, the dialogue concludes, we have demolished the architecture of community. I'm fascinated by that phrase, the architecture of community. It implies that social cohesion isn't just a spontaneous feeling that magically occurs when people live near each other.
It requires actual physical infrastructure. It requires spaces intentionally designed to foster gathering, lingering, and accidental interaction.
If you bulldoze the physical buildings, or if you transform them into silent transactional laptop factories, you bulldoze the community itself. But here is the massive counterargument that always comes up in this discussion, and I want to push back on the text's pessimism here.
Okay, what's the pushback?
Even if the physical pubs and cafes are gone, aren't we just replacing them with something better? I mean, we have the internet. We are more connected than any generation in human history. Don't digital spaces, group chats, forums, sprawling social media networks count as our new, modernized third places?
The instructors actually anticipate that exact counterargument. It is the most common defense of our current digital lifestyle. However, in the subsequent section of the transcript, the source material forcefully deconstructs that idea, explaining exactly why these digital spaces fail as viable substitutes.
Why do they fail?
To understand this failure, the dialogue introduces a critical sociological concept, the necessity of serendipitous encounters.
A serendipitous encounter is an unplanned, chance interaction that yields a positive result. It's not a scheduled Zoom meeting or a planned dinner date.
Right. It is the act of simply bumping into someone.
It is seeing the same person walking their golden retriever in the park every morning at 7 a.m. It is exchanging a nod with the person who always takes the same commuter train as you.
Sociologists categorize these types of peripheral relationships as weak ties. At first glance, the term weak ties sounds dismissive, as if these relationships are unimportant. Your strong ties are your intimate family members and your closest lifelong friends. But the text makes a profound assertion. It is actually the weak ties that serve as the essential glue holding a functional society together.
Why are weak ties the glue? If I have a strong family unit and 5 great friends, why does it matter if I know the name of the guy who sells newspapers on the corner?
Because your strong ties are an insulated bubble. Weak ties provide you with a sense of belonging to a broader, complex ecosystem. When you have regular serendipitous encounters with the barista or the mail carrier or the other regulars at a neighborhood park, you feel recognized by your environment.
You're part of the fabric.
You are acknowledged as a thread in the larger fabric of the neighborhood. Furthermore, these physical third places force you to share space with a cross-section of humanity.
And this is where the text heavily critiques our digital networks. The speaker in the dialogue refers to digital substitutes, like having 500 followers on an app, or sitting in an exclusive group chat as a hollow imitation of true camaraderie.
Yes.
Why hollow? If I'm talking to my friends online for 6 hours a day, why does the masterclass text insist that this fails to provide true community?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it's because the mechanics of digital spaces are fundamentally opposed to the mechanics of a third place. Digital spaces fail as communal glue because they are hyper-curated and relentlessly algorithmic. In a physical public park, you cannot control who sits on the bench next to you. You are forced to rub shoulders with people from entirely different demographics, different age groups, and vastly different socioeconomic backgrounds. You might have to navigate an interaction with a noisy teenager or an eccentric elderly person. That forced mingling is the engine of social empathy.
Empathy requires exposure to difference. When you see someone from a completely different walk of life, dealing with the same rainy weather or laughing at the same dog in the park, you recognize their shared humanity. But our digital spaces eliminate that exposure entirely.
Exactly. The algorithmic nature of the internet is designed to build an echo chamber. Your social media feeds and your private group chats are mathematically calibrated to ensure you only ever interact with people who think precisely like you.
They share your exact interests, your political leanings, your sense of humor.
And the algorithm actively hides anyone who might challenge your worldview or create friction.
It's an environment of total curation. We are just shouting into a padded room where everyone is already nodding in agreement. And if someone says something we mildly disagree with, we don't have to navigate the social friction of a conversation. We just press a button and block them from our reality.
Which is incredibly dangerous for society.
The transcript is arguing that a space where you can instantly delete anyone who makes you uncomfortable is not a community. It is a customized illusion. It is a hollow imitation because it lacks the necessary friction of the real world.
We have mapped out 2 monumental intertwined crises here. Our internal cognitive capacity, our ability to focus and engage in deep work, is being splintered by the multi-billion-dollar algorithms of the attention economy.
And simultaneously,
our external communities are being atomized by the hyper-commodification of physical third places and the rise of hollow, algorithmic, digital echo chambers. Both the internal mind and the external public square are collapsing under the weight of a system that prioritizes frictionless consumption over human connection.
It is an incredibly bleak diagnostic picture. I mean, it feels like we are trapped in a pincer movement between tech companies hijacking our brains and a transactional economy destroying our neighborhoods. So how do we fight back? If the diagnosis is this severe, what is the prescription? How do we resist this overwhelming culture of hyper-individualism and atomization?
Well, the masterclass transcript is remarkably grounded here. It does not offer a utopian, easy fix. The host in the dialogue acknowledges a deeply relatable human truth about why we fall into these traps.
Because it's hard not to.
Right. They point out that when Friday night rolls around, after a grueling 40-hour work week, your cognitive endurance is utterly depleted. You have nothing left in the tank. In that moment of exhaustion, the path of least resistance is overwhelmingly seductive.
It is the most relatable dilemma in the modern world. You know, intellectually, that you should leave your apartment. You know you should go to the local community center or join that local club or meet up with a group of acquaintances.
But you are tired.
Your focus is splintered and your couch is incredibly comfortable. The television is right there. The food delivery app is on your phone. Staying home and retreating into your customized noise-canceling digital bubble requires absolute zero effort. Fighting that inertia feels impossible.
The effort required is substantial, which is exactly why the text delivers a powerful and seemingly paradoxical remedy. The speaker in the dialogue states unequivocally, we have to actively choose friction.
Here's where it gets really interesting. We have to actively choose friction. That is the defining insight of this entire deep dive. It is so fascinating because everything in our modern consumer culture tells us the exact opposite.
It really does.
We spend our entire lives and a massive amount of our income trying to systematically eliminate friction from our existence. We buy apps to make ordering food 10 seconds faster. We buy smart devices to turn off our lights so we don't have to experience the friction of standing up and walking across the room. We view friction as the ultimate enemy of progress.
But the text argues that this relentless obsession with a frictionless life is precisely what has caused our societal atomization. Frictionless interaction is, by definition, transactional. It is the act of bypassing the barista by ordering on an app.
It is the act of blocking out the noise of the cafe with headphones.
When you remove all friction from human interaction, you remove the humanity itself. Therefore, the only way to rebuild our splintered focus and our atomized communities is to intentionally inject friction back into our daily routines.
Synthesizing everything we've discussed today, this means accepting that the action which is best for our cognitive and social well-being is almost always going to be the harder, less convenient choice.
Yes, unfortunately it is.
It means that when Friday night arrives and the path of least resistance is calling to you from the couch, you have to acknowledge the urge and then actively decide to do the difficult thing. You have to force yourself to put on your shoes, walk out the front door, and navigate the unpredictable, friction-filled real world.
You have to choose to go to a local establishment and engage in the awkward friction of striking up a conversation with a stranger. You have to choose to leave your phone in another room and experience the uncomfortable friction of boredom while trying to read a challenging book.
It's basically a workout for your brain and your social skills.
Exactly. The text does not pretend this is easy. It requires immense, continuous effort. But the masterclass dialogue lays out the stakes with absolute clarity. The alternative to actively choosing this friction is total, irrevocable societal isolation.
When you reframe the stakes like that, when you remember that the alternative is a public health crisis of loneliness, on par with a smoking epidemic, the temporary discomfort of putting on your shoes and going to a local park suddenly seems like a laughably small price to pay.
Right.
It is not just about having a fun Friday night.
Yeah.
It is a fundamental matter of survival for the human spirit.
It is an act of defiance against an atomized system. And the brilliance of the transcript is how it arms the student to articulate this exact act of defiance. The instructors return at the end of the lesson to highlight how the C2 grammatical structures elevate this call to action.
Right. If you are going to argue against the crushing weight of the path of least resistance, you need language that carries absolute conviction. You use the cleft sentences. What really drives it home for me is the necessity of friction.
Or it is the disappearance of communal spaces that forces us into isolation.
By integrating these advanced linguistic structures, your spoken English transforms. You're no longer just complaining about spending too much time on your phone. You're delivering a structural critique of modern societal architecture. You command the room.
Which brings us to the end of our dual journey today.
It does. To summarize this deep dive for you, the listener, we have mapped out some incredibly challenging territory. We've learned that our cognitive bandwidth, our biological capacity for deep work and creative boredom, is being systematically splintered by an insidious attention economy that rewires our neuroplasticity for constant dopamine hits.
Simultaneously,
our serendipitous social encounters, the vital weak ties that form the glue of our communities, are being atomized by the hyper-commodification of our third places and the rise of hollow, algorithmic echo chambers.
But the core message of the transcript is that we are not defenseless. We have equipped ourselves today with the precise C2 vocabulary to name the enemy. We understand the physical reality of being splintered, we can identify an insidious systemic design flaw, and we recognize the transactional nature of our modern physical spaces.
Plus the grammar.
Furthermore, we have unlocked the grammatical power of the cleft sentence to emphasize these concepts with unapologetic authority.
Most importantly, we've learned that understanding this vocabulary is not just an academic exercise designed to help you pass a Cambridge language exam. It is a daily, practical survival guide.
It really is.
Treating your attention as a finite, sacred resource that must be violently protected and actively choosing the friction of real-world community over the convenience of digital isolation are non-negotiable necessities if you want to remain a whole, functional person in a splintered world.
The high-level linguistic tools are merely the vehicle. The true ultimate goal of this lesson is reclaiming sovereignty over your own mental and communal space.
And that profound challenge leaves us with a final, provocative thought for you to mull over as you navigate the rest of your day. Based on everything we've unpacked from this masterclass, if our internal mental focus and our external physical communities are both being heavily commodified, dismantled, and then sold back to us in the form of frictionless digital substitutes, what happens to our sense of true, authentic self when we finally decide to log off, step outside into the physical world, and simply sit in silence?
That is a question that requires a tremendous amount of deep, uninterrupted work to answer.
It really does. So the next time you sit down in a quiet room with a physical novel and you feel that inevitable creeping itch in the back of your brain urging you to check your glowing screen, remember that you are fighting a battle for your own cognitive architecture. It's not just a book. It's a battleground against a multi-billion-dollar algorithm. And choosing to endure the friction of turning the page instead of taking the easy path of turning on your phone is the very first step in reclaiming your mind.